They told the farm girl she didn't belong in the exam hall. Minutes later, in Topeka, Kansas, she would silence a teacher, shake a school, and awaken an entire state. Morning in Topeka opened with a pale light after a cold night. On the boulevard leading to the center, yellow school buses closed their doors and released streams of students onto the sidewalks. Roosevelt Middle School stood tall, its red brick walls like a giant hearth for the city. Glass doors gleamed. The marble-tiled lobby reflected shoes as if it were still water. The air carried chatter and the faint scent of polished wood. Everything was neat, ordered, radiant. Among the crowd, a small figure moved differently. A pair of tall farm boots, cracked and dry like parched soil after a drought, struck the floor with slow, steady rhythm. This was Lydia Carter, 12 years old, from Clayton, a rural stretch of Kansas known more for wheat and wind than for scholars. Her gray coat was worn thin, its sleeves patched. Her braids had been tied in haste, stray strands falling loose. She neither raised her chin in defiance nor lowered it in shame. She walked straight, eyes fixed on the notice board, searching for her exam room. Whispers started along the staircase. One boy muttered just loud enough for others to hear, "Farm kids don't belong here." The phrase caught quickly, like a gust rattling dry leaves. A few laughed, some stared at her boots. The doubt and disdain spread through the hall like cold air through a draft. Lydia heard every word. Back home, the Kansas wind swept for miles without a wall to bounce off. Words, too, sometimes passed through without echo. Her mother had told her, "If you want to cross a wide field, keep your eyes fixed on the horizon." Lydia did exactly that. She looked at the board and found room 204. She knew farmland was farmland and math was math. One did not diminish the other if the person in between stood firm. Room 204 was quieter. At the front stood Mr. Richard Steinberg, tall shoulders, stern face, and the sharp eyes of a man who measured worth before granting respect. Around him lingered rumors of MIT, of graduate research, of variational calculus. He wrote on the board like a swordsman slashing at air. Chalk in his hand moved fast, leaving behind a dense forest of symbols. Above it, a clock ticked steadily, indifferent. Lydia took the last seat, laid her sharpened pencil on the desk, and listened. The sound of chalk against the board reminded her of a spade digging into soil. Steady, forceful. Steinberg turned, scanning the room. His gaze landed on her cracked boots. His lips curled into a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Well, what do we have here? A farmhand strayed into the Hall of Learning?" Laughter rippled across the desks. Lydia looked at the wood grain in front of her, where a thin scratch ran across the surface. She traced it with her pencil tip, imagining a furrow in a field. Then she raised her eyes, calm, unshaken. Steinberg lifted the chalk again. He wrote furiously. This time not a routine equation, but a problem he called unsolvable. A non-linear system with rigid boundary conditions, the kind of riddle that haunted graduate students in functional analysis. Greek letters crowded the space like a thicket of thorns. At the end, he marked a question sign, heavy as a hammer. He turned and said slowly, his voice cutting the air, "If you can solve this, my job is yours." Silence, then a chorus of gasps. A boy whistled under his breath. A girl drew in a sharp breath. The sentence dropped like a stone in the pond of the room, sending rings outward. Lydia rose. She neither smoothed her coat nor cleared her throat. She spoke a single word. "Deal." Her voice was low, yet it traveled cleanly, like a knock at midnight. Those who had laughed now hushed. Steinberg raised an eyebrow. He crossed his arms, but under the sleeves his knuckles pressed together. At that very moment, Principal Marcus Williams happened to walk by. He stopped at the door, having caught the last exchange. He studied the scene. Steinberg with his board of symbols, Lydia with her boots. He had heard too many stories of talent buried under ridicule, of doors closed before a child could even knock. "Is there a problem, Mr. Steinberg?" Marcus asked. "A volunteer," Steinberg replied with forced courtesy. "Wishes to prove herself. I am allowing her the chance." Marcus hesitated. He disliked contests born of pride. Yet when his eyes rested on Lydia, standing steady with chalk in hand, he felt the weight of choice. Some challenges could crush a child. Others could ignite them. He nodded, silently granting the moment. Lydia walked down the aisle. Her boots struck wood with solid beats. Heads turned to follow her, like stalks of wheat bending to wind. She stopped at the blackboard, eyes sweeping the forest of symbols. She touched the stub of chalk, small and worn. She touched it again, as if testing the handle of a plow before driving it into soil. She began with a single line, not a direct solution, but a question to reframe the terrain. Can we shift the coordinates to make the landscape clearer? Then she rewrote a core expression, transforming it into something simpler. The symbols lost some of their menace. Her voice was quiet, enough for the front row to hear. If we place this in the correct Sobolev space, the weak derivatives and boundary conditions align naturally. A murmur rose and fell. Steinberg tilted his head. She was not retracing his steps. He had hacked through the north gate of the forest while she was walking a sunlit path from the south. He rested a hand on the board's edge. Something in his chest faltered. Lydia paused, looking out the window. Topeka's sky was gray and stretched wide. A thin streak of wind cut through the trees. Her mother's voice echoed, "Math lives in nature, if you listen to its breath." Lydia drew a small sketch. A simplified boundary turned into a clear outline. She described it as one would describe a wooden fence enclosing a garden, not a barrier, but a frame. "She's drawing the problem," a student whispered. "No," another replied softly. "She's seeing it." Her chalk scraped steadily, line by line. She set substitutions, tamed wild terms, invoked a theorem like greeting an old friend. MIT was not in the room anymore. Prestige and ridicule faded. There was only a blackboard, a farm girl, and a problem yielding ground. Steinberg frowned. He recognized the place where he himself had stumbled years ago, a bottleneck like a canyon wall. He had tried to break it open with force. Lydia, however, trickled water through the crack, curving gently until the stone softened. When she reached the crucial step, the entire room held its breath. A student slid his chair closer without realizing, afraid to miss a note. Principal Marcus glanced at the clock. Barely half an hour had passed. He remembered an afternoon long ago, standing at a small-town ball field, watching a skinny boy catch an impossible throw, the crowd falling silent as if witnessing a law of nature break. That silence was here again, and it smelled of truth. Lydia closed the loop. She condensed the expression to its elegant core. She checked each step, moving her eyes left to right like a farmer walking a furrow. She wrote the conclusion plainly, no flourish, no boast. Then she set the chalk down. Dust clung to her fingers. No one clapped. No one laughed. The silence was heavy, not cruel but reverent. Steinberg stepped forward, reading the lines. Twice he stopped, hunting for a flaw. He found none. He raised his head, eyes stripped of arrogance. His throat was dry. Finally he muttered, mostly to himself, "Interesting." Marcus drew a slow breath. Warmth spread in his chest like touching the flank of an old horse. Rough, steady, alive. He looked down the long hallway of the school, imagining all the children who had passed through, each carrying a lantern. Some blazed, some flickered, some barely sparked. Today, a new flame had been struck. Lydia returned to her seat. She did not seek eyes or praise. She wiped chalk dust with her handkerchief. Back in Clayton, when a furrow was finished, no one stood to admire the line. They rinsed their hands and prepared the next. She opened her notebook, wrote the date, and added a short note. Topeka, cold morning, blackboard. Two girls whispered, "I've never seen anyone write like that." "No," the other replied. "I've never seen anyone stand like that." Steinberg lowered himself into his chair, fingers interlaced. For a moment he looked older, not from defeat, but from the realization of a road he had never taken. He thought of the students who had passed through his class in cracked boots, carrying questions he had dismissed. Marcus left the doorway. He knew this was not the end. More fields lay ahead, more mornings, more battles. But in room 204, on a cold Topeka morning, something had shifted. The laughter at the beginning had receded like shadows at the strike of fire. Chalk dust hung in the air, drifting down like first snow. Lydia gazed once more through the window. The sky was gray, but no longer heavy. She thought of the old rope pulley on the farm well, creaking at dawn. She thought of her mother's hand guiding hers over a notebook, teaching her to hear the rhythm between heartbeats. A faint smile touched her lips. The bell rang, sharp and clear. Test papers slid across desks like dry leaves on a floor. Pens and pencils lifted. Lydia lifted hers too, but before she looked down, she glanced at the blackboard. There, faint marks still lingered. Chalk lines thin as a horizon across a wheat field. She knew she was still only the girl from Clayton. She also knew that some doors opened only when one dared to stand before them. In the lobby outside, shoes still clicked and voices still drifted. But inside room 204, the air glowed faintly warmer. A page had turned, a story had begun. And if anyone someday asked where the legend started, the answer would be simple. It began with cracked boots on marble tiles, a stub of chalk in a steady hand, and a single quiet word that cut through the noise. Deal. The night in Clayton was always shorter than the night in Topeka. Out there, under the vast Kansas sky, darkness yielded to dawn before the rooster crowed. On the Carter farm, the first sound of morning was not an alarm clock, but the rattle of rope against wood, the old pulley creaking as it drew water from the well. At 4 o'clock, Lydia was already awake. She slipped into her patched jacket, pushed her arms into gloves a size too big, and stepped out into the raw morning air. The ground still held the frost of night. The cattle stirred, their breath steaming like soft chimneys in the dim light. Lydia carried a bucket in each hand, the metal biting her palms. She walked with the rhythm of work. Left, right, pause, lift. Every motion matched a number in her mind. She was not just hauling water. She was reciting equations. 2 + 2 is 4. 4 × 4 is 16, she murmured, not as a child repeating basics, but as a farmer measuring rows, as a student testing balance. Numbers kept her company where conversation was scarce. When she poured the water into the trough, ripples spread outward. The circles reminded her of sine curves, the gentle wave that never lost its form. She stared for a moment, then whispered to herself, Fx equals sin x. The curve of the water is the curve of time. Her mother had once said the same words, long ago in Houston, back when the world still believed her future would rise among rockets. Before Lydia was born, her mother, Ann Carter, had interned at NASA's Johnson Space Center. She had touched the cold skeleton of a shuttle and run simulations on screens filled with numbers brighter than stars. She could have stayed, but love and illness called her back to Kansas. Her husband's lungs had faltered, the diagnosis had come, and Anne chose the weight of home over the pull of the stars. She never regretted it. Not when she stirred soup at night, not when she carried feed for the cows. She looked at her daughter and saw in Lydia the continuation of both worlds, the soil of Kansas and the equations of the cosmos. "Math is everywhere," Anne used to whisper as she helped Lydia with long division by lantern light. "It's in the turn of a wheel, in the arc of a barn roof, in the way rivers bend. It is not just numbers on paper. It is the breath of the world." Lydia believed her. Each morning's chores became lessons. When she pushed hay into the stalls, she thought of vectors, force, direction, weight. When she guided the plow, she pictured parabolas. Even the pattern of seeds in her hand seemed to follow the quiet order of probability. The work was not easy. Her boots grew heavy with mud, her shoulders stiff with labor, yet the rhythm of toil built a kind of language inside her, where equations were not abstract but alive. She would whisper formulas under her breath as she milked the cow. Integration was like gathering milk into a pail, summing tiny streams into a whole. Differentiation was like pulling one single thread from a hay bale, understanding the part that built the whole. On some mornings, her mother would stand at the kitchen door, watching Lydia carry her weight across the yard. She would see her daughter's lips move and know she was calculating. Anne would smile, proud and a little sorrowful. "Your father always said the prairie raises children strong, but I think, Lydia, it's raising you wise." By 6, the sky lightened. The horizon glowed orange, wheat fields catching the first glimmers. Lydia wiped her hands, brushed hay from her sleeves, and sat for a few minutes on the fence post. She opened the little notebook she carried everywhere. Its pages were filled with formulas scribbled alongside sketches of barns, cows, and furrows. One page showed a tractor wheel, its spokes labeled with angles, cosines marked in the margins. Another had a drawing of the family well, annotated with formulas for pressure and depth. That morning she wrote, "Dawn il work plus thought. Work feeds the farm. Thought feeds the soul." Her pencil lingered. She closed the notebook and looked across the land. Fields stretched farther than her eye could follow, each furrow like a line waiting to be solved. She felt small, but she also felt connected, as if the land itself whispered numbers only she could hear. Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen smelled of coffee and bread. Her mother sat at the table, pale but smiling, the cough lingering in her chest. She touched Lydia's hand as the girl entered. "Already finished?" Anne asked. "Yes, Mama." "And what equation kept you company today?" Lydia grinned. "The ripple of water. Sine curves." Anne's eyes softened. "Good. Then you understand. The farm is not apart from learning. It is the lesson itself." For breakfast, they sat together in silence, as they often did. Silence was not emptiness here. It was a quilt spread over two weary souls. Warm and familiar. By 7, the rooster crowed again. Lydia packed her worn satchel, tucked the notebook inside, and kissed her mother's cheek. The school bus would arrive soon. She would ride 30 miles with children who mocked her boots, her patched coat, her quietness. But she carried more than appearances. She carried the fields, the well, the notebook, the whispers of sine and cosine in rippling water. That was why, in Topeka, she had stood steady. She did not see Steinberg's board as a battlefield of Greek letters. She saw it as a field of wheat, furrows waiting for patience, rows waiting for harvest. She had already plowed those rows in her mind, morning after morning, long before anyone in Roosevelt Middle School had heard her name. On the bus that day, other children laughed, passed notes, sang songs. Lydia stared out the window. Fields blurred past, stitched together like a patchwork quilt of earth. She held her pencil loosely, tracing invisible shapes against the glass. The bus bumped, the pencil slipped, but her thoughts stayed steady. The world does not give me ease, she thought, but it gives me patterns. That is enough. When she arrived at school, the marble floor of Roosevelt once again gleamed against her boots. The other children strutted in polished shoes. But Lydia knew the shine on marble did not matter. What mattered was the soil on her boots, proof that she had walked fields wide enough to hold infinity. That night, after the exam and the challenge, when Topeka's street lamps flickered on, Lydia sat by her window back home. Her mother rested in the next room, coughing softly in her sleep. Lydia opened her notebook once more. She wrote, "Today, they laughed. Then they grew silent. The farm gave me strength. The board gave me voice. Math is not away from the earth. It is the earth written in symbols. I only needed to listen." She set the pencil down and looked out at the prairie. The stars above Kansas were sharp and endless. Lydia whispered to herself as sleep came. Even the stars obey equations. Even the stars plow furrows across the dark. And with that, she closed her eyes, ready for another dawn, another wait, another lesson. In the days that followed the exam, whispers moved through Roosevelt Middle School like wind bending wheat. Some whispered admiration, some disbelief, many suspicion. Could it be true that a farm girl had stood against Mr. Richard Steinberg and not faltered? For years, Steinberg's reputation had been unshaken. He was known as the hardest teacher in Topeka, a man who wore the word MIT like armor. He spoke of his unfinished research as if it were scripture. Students respected him, but in the way soldiers respect barbed wire, with fear and distance. He was not a man who bent, but after that morning, something had cracked. He told himself it was nothing, a coincidence, a trick of intuition. Yet the memory of Lydia's chalk strokes haunted him. The girl had approached the problem not as a scholar but as a farmer, plowing her own furrow, and the furrow had reached harvest. Steinberg resolved to test her again, this time publicly, so there would be no room for doubt. It was a Wednesday when he made the announcement. The classroom buzzed with restless chatter until he raised his hand. Silence fell. His voice carried across the rows with cold precision. "Next week, we will host a demonstration. I will present a problem from my graduate work at MIT, a problem that resisted me for months. And our farm guest," he lingered on the word, "will attempt it before us all." A ripple of laughter spread, though quieter than before. Lydia sat at her desk, her pencil poised. She did not lift her eyes. She only said, "Deal." The word struck again like a stone on water, sending ripples through every corner of the room. Students leaned toward each other. She agreed again. Some shook their heads. Some smirked. But a few, just a few, looked at Lydia differently now, as if a lamp had been lit in a dark barn and they were curious to see what lay inside. Steinberg's pride demanded more witnesses. He invited 2 colleagues to attend, both veteran teachers who admired his rigor. And then, almost on impulse, he sent a message to Principal Marcus Williams requesting his presence. If Lydia failed, and surely she would, no one could later twist the story. That night, Steinberg reopened his old thesis. The pages smelled faintly of mildew, but the symbols still burned with the arrogance of youth. He chose a problem deep in the heart of variational calculus, one tangled with non-linear constraints. He remembered sweating over it in Cambridge dormitories, pacing corridors with chalk-stained fingers. "This one broke me," he whispered to himself. "It will break her." But sleep did not come easily. In the dark, he saw her again, chalk in hand, her eyes steady as prairie sky. He pushed the thought away. She will fail. She must fail. On the morning of the challenge, room 204 was packed. Not only students, but teachers gathered, drawn by the scent of drama. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy as thunderclouds before a storm. Steinberg stood at the board, tall and commanding, his chalk ready. He turned, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on Lydia. She had chosen the same seat as always, the last row near the window. Her boots, cracked and worn, tapped quietly against the floor. She looked no different, yet something about her presence unsettled him. "Come forward," Steinberg said, his voice sharpened with challenge. Lydia rose. The whispers started again, softer this time, mixed with curiosity. She walked the aisle, her pace unhurried, her hands steady. When she reached the front, Steinberg gestured to the board. "This problem," he said, "is drawn from my own work at MIT. I assure you, it is not fit for a child. But if you claim to see truth in numbers, here is your chance." The board soon filled with dense expressions, functional minimization, inequality constraints, symbols curling like vines. Steinberg stepped aside, chalk dust still clinging to his sleeve. He folded his arms, daring her to begin. Lydia studied the problem. She saw not just symbols, but shapes, motions, whispers of the land. The constraints were fences. The functions were fields. The minimization was nothing more than a farmer's search for the shortest path between two chores when the day was short and the sun unforgiving. She touched the chalk. For a moment, she remembered the weight of buckets at dawn, the ripples of water in the trough, the soft voice of her mother. Math lives in nature. Listen to it breathe. The classroom stilled. Even the clock seemed hesitant. Then Lydia began. She did not attack the problem head-on. She redrew it in gentler terms, shifting the language of MIT into the dialect of the prairie. She invoked an alternative formulation, explaining quietly as she worked. "We do not need brute force. We need perspective. Like walking around a boulder instead of breaking it." Lines filled the board. She used transformations that Steinberg had never taught, weaving connections between geometry and calculus as if she were braiding rope. She paused often, not out of fear but out of care, ensuring each step lay firmly on the ground before she placed the next. Murmurs spread in the room. A boy who had once mocked her now leaned forward, eyes wide. A girl at the front scribbled notes furiously, afraid to lose a single thread. Steinberg watched, arms still folded. He tried to dismiss her moves as childish tricks, yet slowly dread crept in. She was not floundering. She was charting a map, and the map was leading straight to the heart of the problem. At one point, Lydia stopped and looked at the class. "This constraint," she said softly, pointing to a term, "is not a wall. It is a curve. If you follow its bend, you find space to breathe." Her words were plain, but they pierced deeper than jargon. Students nodded. Even one of Steinberg's colleagues tilted his head, intrigued. Minutes stretched. The chalk shrank. At last, Lydia wrote a final expression, neat and balanced. She stepped back, hands white with dust, eyes calm. Silence fell again. No laughter, no whispers, only the quiet weight of something undeniable. Principal Marcus cleared his throat. "Remarkable," he said simply. One teacher leaned close to the board. "She's not just right," he murmured. "She's elegant." Steinberg's jaw tightened. He searched for flaws, desperate for a crack in her reasoning. He found none. His armor of pride, polished with years of intimidation, began to rust under the gaze of the very students he once commanded. Lydia returned to her seat. She did not smile, did not seek approval. She opened her notebook, jotted a single line. Math is a field. Every path has a harvest. And in that room, with chalk dust still floating like ash from a fire, a teacher's bet had turned into something else. Not a test of one girl, but a revelation of how many truths had been buried beneath years of fear. The room in Roosevelt Middle School had never felt like this before. It was as if the air itself had grown dense, like the heavy stillness before a thunderstorm on the Kansas prairie. Desks, chalk, and students all seemed suspended in a silence that trembled with expectation. Lydia stood at the front, her small frame dwarfed by the blackboard behind her. The chalk rested between her fingers, worn down to a stub, ready to crumble. To most, it was a fragile thing. To her, it was a plowshare, the tool with which she would carve open the soil of doubt. Every pair of eyes was fixed on her. Some gleamed with ridicule, others with pity, a few with quiet awe. At the back, Principal Marcus Williams leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, face unreadable. And on the side, Richard Steinberg, the teacher who had issued the challenge, stood tall and rigid, his arms folded like gates locked against an intruder. The blackboard loomed like a battlefield. Lines of symbols already lay across it, drawn by Steinberg's own hand. Functional inequalities, boundary conditions, variational operators curling like barbed wire. The problem was not a puzzle to be solved, but a fortress built to repel. Lydia stepped closer. She did not see a fortress. She saw a field. And she had walked fields all her life. She lifted the chalk. The first sound, scritch, was sharp and clean, slicing through the silence. That small noise seemed louder than the laughter that had filled the room earlier. Students sat straighter, ears pricked, as if waiting for a verdict. Her hand moved with patience, almost reverence. She did not rush, did not flinch. Each line was deliberate, like a farmer setting a furrow straight and true. She paused to examine her work, then pressed forward, erasing here, redrawing there, guiding the problem into a shape that made sense to her eyes. The chalk squeaked again, rhythm steady, like a drumbeat echoing across a plain. She began not with grand theorems, but with small adjustments. "We shift the frame," she murmured, barely above a whisper, "so that the curve does not fight us." It was not a lecture, yet the class leaned in, straining to hear. The board filled slowly. Where Steinberg's marks had resembled tangled brush, hers formed a path. It was not the path taught in textbooks. It was straighter, simpler, born from seeing the problem as part of the land itself. Steinberg's brow furrowed. He recognized what she was doing, but also what she was not doing. She was not following the canonical approach. She was not retracing the weary steps of graduate textbooks. She was inventing. A boy in the front row whispered, "She's not solving, she's changing it." The words spread like a rustle of grass in wind. Lydia did not look up. Her concentration was deep, but not strained. She seemed almost serene, as if she were back in Clayton, drawing lines in the dirt with a stick, letting the earth tell her its secrets. Halfway through, she paused. She set the chalk down and faced the class. Her eyes, clear and steady, swept over them. "This," she said softly, pointing to the obstacle Steinberg had written, "is not a wall. It is a gate. It only looks closed until you walk closer." The simplicity of the words stunned them more than any formula. It was the voice of a child, yet it carried a weight that professors often lost. Gasps rippled. Even one of the visiting teachers tilted forward in his seat, eyebrows raised. She picked the chalk up again. The stub left faint dust across her fingers. With renewed motion, she drew arcs, substitutions, transformations. She braided algebra and geometry together as if weaving rope, strong and flexible. The battlefield shifted before everyone's eyes. The fortress was becoming farmland. Steinberg's jaw tightened. For years, he had commanded fear. He had thrived on the silence of students too timid to challenge him. But this silence was different. It was not fear. It was awe. And it was not directed at him. Minute by minute, the chalk grew smaller, her lines clearer. Students who once mocked her now sat forward, mesmerized. Their pencils scribbled notes, not because they understood every symbol, but because they sensed history in motion. Principal Marcus felt his throat tighten. He had spent decades in education, seen prodigies and pretenders alike. Yet this was something else. It was not only knowledge but grace, not only precision but presence. He thought of all the children who had passed through Roosevelt, of those who had left crushed under doubt. He thought of how many doors might have stayed closed if not for this moment. Finally, Lydia reached the last transformation. Her chalk was barely more than a grain between her fingers. She wrote the final expression, neat and balanced, as simple as a completed row of wheat. Then, without a word, she placed the chalk on the tray. The silence that followed was vast. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of reverence, a silence that held breath, that honored what it had witnessed. One teacher whispered to another, "She's not just right. She's different. She sees in ways we forgot." The boy who had mocked her earlier felt his cheeks burn. He stared at the board, wishing he could erase his laughter, replace it with applause. Steinberg stepped forward. He traced her lines with his eyes, searching desperately for cracks. His fingers twitched as if longing to grab the chalk and reclaim control. But the logic held firm. He stopped midway, turned, and for the first time in years, his eyes betrayed uncertainty. He did not speak. Words, once his weapon, now abandoned him. Lydia walked back to her seat. She did not bask in the attention. She did not look for admiration. She simply sat, opened her notebook, and wrote one quiet line. "The board is not a battlefield. It is a field, and fields are meant to grow." The class remained silent long after. Even when the bell rang, its metallic clang seemed out of place, like a crude interruption to a sacred service. Students filed out slowly, glancing back at the board where dust still lingered, a pale echo of the girl who had transformed it. Marcus lingered at the doorway, watching her. He knew that what had happened in room 204 was not the end of a story. It was the spark of something far larger. A truth had been unearthed, not just about one child, but about all the children who had been told they did not belong. That night, as the janitor cleaned the classroom, he paused before erasing the board. For a long time, he simply stared at the symbols, feeling as though they belonged not to numbers, but to something greater, something eternal. Only when the eraser met the chalk did the battlefield fade, leaving behind nothing but a memory. But in every desk, in every whisper carried home, the memory burned on. The board had been a battlefield. Lydia had walked onto it with cracked boots and a stub of chalk, and without raising her voice, without striking a blow, she had won. The blackboard was still gray with dust when Lydia returned to her seat. Students filed out of room 204 slowly, glancing back as though afraid the marks might vanish like a dream. Richard Steinberg lingered near the board, rigid, silent, unable to hide the fracture in his armor. Principal Marcus Williams said nothing, but his eyes told the story. Something irreversible had happened. But Lydia herself was calm. She closed her notebook, slipped the pencil into the spine, and held it close to her chest. To her, what she had done was not extraordinary. It was simply natural. She had only followed the patterns she had known since childhood. patterns not from textbooks, but from the land itself. Long before that morning in Topeka, Lydia had been tracing invisible equations across the Kansas prairie. When she was younger, she spent hours lying on her back in the fields, watching clouds drift and break apart. She noticed how the edges of clouds curled like spirals, similar to the grain of wood in the barn beams. She would stretch her arms wide and whisper, "Circles, arcs, sine waves." She saw geometry in the flight of birds, symmetry in the wings of grasshoppers, probability in the way seeds fell from her hand. The prairie was not empty to her. It was alive with numbers and forms, each whispering a quiet truth. Her mother often found her crouched in the dirt, arranging pebbles into triangles, or mapping the shadows of fence posts as the sun slid across the sky. "You're not playing," Anne would say softly. "You're proving." And Lydia would smile without looking up, her hands dusty, her heart full. That memory came back to her in the middle of the exam hall, when she stood before Steinberg's impossible fortress of equations. She had not seen boundaries and obstacles. She had seen rivers and furrows. "This constraint," she had told the class, "is not a wall. It is a curve." Where others saw mathematics as something built of stone, rigid, cold, unyielding, Lydia saw it as soil. Soil bends, breathes, and gives. A farmer knows this truth, and Lydia, more than anyone, had lived it. After the challenge, word spread quickly through Roosevelt. By lunchtime, whispers carried through the cafeteria like sparks on dry grass. She solved it. Steinberg couldn't argue. The farm girl saw something we didn't. Many laughed nervously, still unwilling to believe. But some looked at her with a new light in their eyes. They remembered the steady silence in the classroom, the way her chalk strokes had felt inevitable. For Lydia, the noise meant little. She sat outside, beneath a bare tree, unwrapping her sandwich. She traced a circle in the dirt with her shoe. In her mind, she replayed not the class's reaction but the fields back home. The rolling waves of wheat under wind, the curve of the Kansas River, the arc of the barn roof her father had built before illness took him. Each memory was a theorem, written in the language of prairie. That evening she walked home from the bus stop, the sky lit in bands of gold and violet. The farm greeted her with its familiar orchestra, the creak of the barn door, the lowing of cattle, the squeal of the pump handle. She set down her satchel and went to the well. As she pulled the rope, water surged up, shimmering in the fading light. She watched ripples spread outward, circles upon circles, each weaker but never lost. She bent close and whispered, "Like a function decaying but never vanishing." Her mother stood nearby, leaning on the porch rail. Anne coughed, then smiled. "What problem did they give you today?" "An impossible one," Lydia answered. She didn't boast. Her tone was quiet, almost weary, as though the weight of the chalk still lingered on her fingers. "And how did you face it?" "The way I face the field," Lydia said simply. "One line at a time. Furrow after furrow. Patterns appear if you let them." Anne's eyes filled. She thought of Houston, of NASA, of dreams deferred. But she also thought of Kansas, of her daughter's eyes seeing what many had forgotten to look for. She whispered, "The prairie taught you more than any university." In the days that followed, Lydia began to notice changes. Students who once mocked her no longer spoke as boldly. A few approached her with hesitant questions about math homework. Teachers paused when she walked into a room, glancing at her as though she carried a secret too heavy for her small frame. But Lydia carried it lightly. She did not hunger for recognition. She only wanted to understand. One afternoon, as she waited for the bus, she pulled out her notebook. On one page, she drew a sketch of the Kansas River, winding like a snake. Beside it, she wrote equations describing curves, limits, and continuity. Then she wrote, "The river does not argue with the land. It bends. That is its strength." To Lydia, that was mathematics, that not a set of rigid laws, but a way of seeing truth in motion, truth that adjusted yet endured. Meanwhile, Richard Steinberg wrestled with his own thoughts. Each night, he reopened his thesis, searching for the comfort of certainty. Yet the more he read, the more he saw Lydia's face, calm and unhurried, turning his fortress into a meadow. He tried to dismiss it as luck, as mimicry, as childish intuition, but the memory refused to fade. He began to ask himself questions he had not asked in years. Had he, in chasing prestige, forgotten how to see simply? Had he buried truth under jargon? And worse, had he crushed other children who might have seen what he could not? The questions weighed heavier than his degrees, but for Lydia, life went on with the same rhythm as before. Dawn came. She hauled water, spread feed, traced patterns in the frost. Numbers whispered through her chores, steady as breath. The farm remained her teacher, the prairie her textbook. And deep inside, she carried a quiet knowing. When the world tried to wall her out, she would find a curve, a bend, a pattern. That was what the prairie had taught her. That was what she had brought to the board. In Topeka, her classmates remembered the silence in room 204. Some carried it with them as they studied, feeling a strange warmth where before there had been fear. They could not explain it, but they knew. Something had shifted. The board had been a battlefield. Lydia had turned it into a field, and in that field, seeds had been planted. Seeds that would take root in minds that had once believed they were barren. Seeds that one day might grow into something greater than any single problem solved. The morning after Lydia's quiet triumph, the walls of Roosevelt Middle School seemed to hum with restless energy. Students carried whispers like contraband in their pockets. She solved it. Steinberg had no words. Did you see the way she stood? By noon, the story had traveled from classrooms to hallways, from hallways to homes. But rumor, fragile as it was, demanded confirmation. Some believed, some doubted. A farm girl solving a graduate-level problem? To many, it sounded like folklore. Yet others, remembering the silence of room 204, felt that folklore was sometimes nothing but truth waiting to be written. Principal Marcus Williams, a man not easily moved by gossip, had seen enough to act. That very afternoon, he sat in his office, staring at the blackboard calculations he had carefully copied before the janitor erased them. He dialed a number in Lawrence, the University of Kansas. "Professor Howard, this is Marcus Williams in Topeka. I need you to look at something." 2 days later, a visitor arrived at Roosevelt. Professor Alan Howard, a senior mathematician from KU, carried himself with the ease of someone who had spent decades lecturing on functional analysis. His gray hair framed sharp eyes, softened only by years of teaching. The faculty gathered in room 204. Steinberg was present too, stiff and unsmiling, arms crossed as though guarding himself. The air was taut with expectation. Marcus handed the professor Lydia's written solution, transcribed line for line. Howard adjusted his glasses, scanned the first page, then the second. His brow furrowed, not in disapproval but in concentration. Slowly the room grew hushed. At last he lowered the paper and looked around the room. "This," he said, his voice calm yet resonant, "is not copied. It is not borrowed. It is original. And more than that, it is elegant." The word hung in the air. Elegant. It was a word mathematicians reserved for rare occasions, when a solution was not only correct, but also illuminated the path like a lantern. Teachers exchanged glances. Students, gathered by the door, widened their eyes. Steinberg's jaw tightened, the color draining from his face. Professor Howard continued, "What you see here is a transformation most graduate students would not attempt. Whoever wrote this has a mind that sees beyond walls. They see patterns, connections, beauty." Marcus smiled faintly. "The author is a 12-year-old girl from Clayton County. Her name is Lydia Carter." Howard blinked, then let out a soft laugh of disbelief. 12? He looked at the board, then back at Marcus. "If this is true, Kansas has a light it cannot afford to ignore." The news spread faster now, no longer rumor, but fact. The Kansas City Star picked up the story, publishing an article titled, "Farmgirl Solves Problem That Stumped MIT Graduate." The photograph showed Roosevelt's old brick walls, and though Lydia herself refused to pose, the image of her empty desk, worn wood, a sharpened pencil, carried its own weight. The state buzzed. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others saw it as a miracle. But for those who had been in room 204, no headline was necessary. They had felt it. They had heard the silence. For Lydia, the attention was unsettling. She returned home each evening to the same chores, the same fields, the same well. She hauled buckets, fed livestock, helped her mother with cooking. Fame did not change the frost on the grass or the sound of wind through barn slats. Yet something was different. Letters began arriving, invitations from universities, notes from curious reporters, requests from teachers across the state. Lydia read them quietly, then tucked them away. She told her mother, "I don't want to be a headline. I just want to learn." Anne nodded. The prairie doesn't ask for applause when it blooms. It just grows. But for Steinberg, the exposure was devastating. He had built his authority on unchallenged knowledge, on the quiet fear of students. Now that authority cracked like thin ice under sudden weight. Parents began to question him. Students no longer lowered their eyes when he entered the room. Some even whispered about his arrogance, his years of dismissing those he deemed unworthy. At night, Steinberg sat at his desk, staring at the articles, the letters, the shifting expressions of colleagues. He told himself it was only a moment, a wave that would pass. Yet deep down, he knew something irreversible had been revealed. The true exposure, however, was not just of Steinberg's pride. Marcus Williams, following a hunch, began to examine old records. He unearthed a troubling pattern. For nearly 2 decades, Steinberg had consistently graded down students from poor families, students of color, farm kids like Lydia. His comments were cruelly uniform. Lacks natural aptitude. Not suited for higher study. Marcus brought the evidence to the school board. Soon, whispers turned into outrage. Parents demanded answers. Former students, now grown, came forward with stories of doors closed, of scholarships lost, of confidence shattered. The problem was no longer just about one girl's triumph. It was about decades of silenced voices. The Kansas City Star returned with a new headline. How many geniuses did we miss? The question hung over every classroom in the state. Through it all, Lydia remained steady. She listened as adults argued, as reporters asked for quotes. She stayed close to her mother, close to the soil that grounded her. To her, mathematics was not about glory or scandal. It was about truth. And truth, like the prairie, belonged to everyone. One evening, sitting by the well, she wrote in her notebook, "Exposure is light. It shows what was hidden, weeds, cracks, seeds alike. But without light, nothing grows. She closed the notebook, looked up at the vast Kansas sky, and whispered, "Let it grow." And so the exposure spread, like sunrise across the prairie, first touching one field, then another, until the whole horizon was alight. But this light did not burn, it healed. The wind in Kansas can carry secrets for miles. It whispers through the wheat, rustles down empty streets, curls around barns and silos. But eventually, every secret finds its way into daylight. Richard Steinberg's secret began to unravel the day Lydia Carter solved his impossible problem. At first, it was only pride that cracked. Then came suspicion. Then came evidence. Principal Marcus Williams was not a man who trusted gossip. He preferred records, ink on paper, proof that could not be denied. Late into the night, by the glow of his desk lamp, he combed through decades of files, report cards, teacher evaluations, college recommendation letters. Patterns emerged like tracks in snow. Time and again, Steinberg had written the same words beside certain names: not gifted, poor aptitude, lacks promise. The names belonged to children from the margins, farm kids, factory kids, students of color, the ones who walked to school with lunch in paper sacks instead of lunch boxes. Marcus underlined the words, each stroke of his pen heavier than the last. It was not one case. It was dozens, scores, perhaps hundreds. How many Lydias had sat in his classroom? How many had left believing they were nothing, when in truth they were something rare? The next morning, Marcus carried the file into a school board meeting. Around the long oak table, members leaned forward as he spread the evidence. Pages rustled like dry leaves. Silence thickened. "This is not a mistake," Marcus said. "It is a pattern, a crime of silence, committed year after year." One board member whispered, "My nephew was in his class. He wanted to study engineering, but Steinberg wrote he lacked ability. He gave up." Another said, "How many futures were stolen?" The question hung heavy. They decided to investigate further, but the news had already slipped beyond the boardroom. By week's end, parents gathered outside Roosevelt Middle School. Some carried signs, some carried photographs of their children. Voices rose in anger and grief. "Justice for our kids! Stop burying brilliance!" The Kansas City Star published a front-page story. "The Hidden Crime in Topeka Classrooms. Reporters unearthed testimonies." A young man in Wichita recalled how Steinberg's words had cost him a scholarship. A woman in Kansas City remembered her daughter crying at night after reading "lacks aptitude" in red ink. Stories poured in like rain on parched earth, each drop swelling the flood. What had once been rumor was now undeniable truth. And through it all, Lydia watched quietly. She did not gloat, did not cheer. In her notebook, she wrote, "If a teacher closes the gate, the field still exists, but the children believe it is gone. That is the true loss." She sat by the well, thinking of the invisible fields in so many hearts, fields that might have borne fruit if only someone had believed. Her mother, hearing the noise on the radio, looked at her and said softly, "Lydia, you opened more than a door. You opened a wound." "And wounds," Lydia answered, "must be cleaned before they heal." Steinberg himself could not escape. Reporters camped outside his house. Former students sent letters, some bitter, some pleading. He walked the halls of Roosevelt with lowered head, his once commanding presence shrunk to a shadow. In faculty meetings, his colleagues avoided his gaze. In classrooms, whispers followed him. He could feel the weight of his own past pressing like stones in his chest. At night, he sat at his desk, staring at the same sentence written long ago in red ink. Not gifted. The words mocked him now. He poured whiskey into a glass but could not drink. Instead, he whispered into the empty room, "What have I done?" Meanwhile, the state stirred. From Dodge City to Lawrence, from Wichita to Kansas City, the story spread. Radio hosts debated, pastors preached, farmers in diners shook their heads, mothers wiped tears. "How many children were told they were nothing?" one caller asked on air. "How many Einsteins in overalls did we lose?" another said. The outrage was not only against one man, it was against the system that allowed prejudice to masquerade as authority, against the silence of institutions that had failed to question, against the indifference that had cost generations their light. In Topeka, Roosevelt Middle School became the eye of the storm. Television crews arrived. Photographers snapped the brick walls, the windows where curious faces peeked out. And always, the story circled back to one girl, the farm girl who had stood against the board and revealed the cracks. Lydia, still only 12, refused interviews. She preferred the quiet of her farm, the whisper of wind over the wheat. Yet her name carried weight she never sought. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Marcus drove out to Clayton. He found Lydia feeding the chickens, her boots dusted white. "Child," he said gently, "do you understand what you've done?" Lydia tilted her head. "I solved a problem." Marcus shook his head. "No, you revealed one." She wiped her hands on her coat. "Then it must be solved, too." The hidden crime was no longer hidden. It stood in the open, raw, and undeniable. And Kansas, with all its fields and towns, faced a question. What would they do with the truth? That night, Lydia opened her notebook once more. She drew a small diagram, a field fenced on every side. Then she erased one line, leaving a gap. Beneath it, she wrote, "A gate may be locked for years, but once it is broken, the wind returns, and the field breathes again." The prairie wind carried her words across the night, as if promising that even the deepest wrongs, once exposed, could give way to healing. The storm of outrage did not pass quickly. It rolled across Kansas like thunder over the plains, shaking towns and schools alike. Parents demanded Richard Steinberg's resignation. Former students carried their stories into board meetings. The press painted him as a villain who had buried promise beneath prejudice. The school board gathered in the gymnasium of Roosevelt Middle, rows of folding chairs filled with anxious faces. The air smelled of sweat, chalk, and fear. Teachers sat stiffly. Parents clutched notebooks. Children whispered, too young to understand but old enough to feel the weight. Steinberg sat alone at the front, shoulders stooped, his once proud face drawn and pale. For the first time in decades, his authority had abandoned him. Principal Marcus opened the meeting. His voice was firm but not angry. "We are here not only to decide a man's fate," he said, "but to decide what kind of school we will be." One parent stood. "He failed my son, called him unfit. That boy now works 2 jobs instead of studying science, because this man said he was worthless." Another mother's voice shook with tears. "My daughter wanted to be a doctor. He told her she lacked natural ability. She stopped trying. Do you know how it feels to watch your child's light dim because of one teacher?" The crowd rumbled with anger. Some shouted for Steinberg to be fired, stripped, disgraced. Others demanded compensation, apologies, justice. And then a small hand rose. It was Lydia. She had been sitting quietly beside her mother, notebook on her lap. Now she stood, boots scuffing the wooden floor, and walked to the microphone. The gymnasium stilled. Her voice, when it came, was soft but clear, carrying farther than anger ever could. "I know you want him gone. I know you want punishment. But listen, revenge does not grow crops. It only burns fields." A hush fell deeper. Even Steinberg lifted his eyes. When someone takes from you, Lydia continued, you can take back, or you can plant again. Taking back leaves nothing. Planting gives more. She turned to Steinberg. You closed gates. Many children believed you. Many fields went untended. That is the wound. But I don't want you cast out. I want you to help reopen those gates. The board shifted, startled. Marcus leaned forward, studying her. What do you ask of him? One member said. Lydia drew a breath. First, that he apologizes to every student he ever hurt. Look them in the eye. Tell them they were never less. Second, that he rewrites every recommendation letter he poisoned. Give those students back what was stolen. And third, she paused, that he helps create a fund for children like me. Poor children. Farm children. The Prairie Scholars Program. So no one is told again they don't belong. The gym murmured. Some frowned. Some wept. A father in the back whispered, She's only 12, and she speaks like a judge. Steinberg rose slowly. His knees trembled. For years he had wielded authority like a weapon. Now it was stripped from him. He faced the crowd, voice raw. I was wrong. His throat tightened. For 20 years I told myself I was protecting standards. I told myself some children did not have the gift. But the truth is, I was protecting my pride. I was wrong. He turned to Lydia, eyes red. Child, you showed me what I forgot. That truth is not mine to guard. It belongs to all. If you will have me, I will do as you ask. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a mother in the front row began to clap. Slowly, others joined. Not all. Some still burned for punishment. But many felt the warmth of something rare, forgiveness offered where vengeance was expected. Marcus looked at Lydia, and his heart swelled with something he had not felt in years, hope. Weeks later, Roosevelt Middle hosted a ceremony in its library. There, Steinberg signed the first letters of apology. He sat at a long table, stacks of paper before him, his handwriting unsteady but honest. Students long grown, some now parents themselves, came to receive the letters. Some accepted with tears, some refused, bitterness still raw. But the act itself, repeated day after day, began to loosen knots in the fabric of trust. The Prairie Scholars Fund was established soon after, seeded by donations from teachers, farmers, and small businesses. Steinberg contributed the largest share from his pension. Its purpose was clear: to lift up children from overlooked corners, to ensure no light went unnoticed. For Lydia, life returned to rhythm. She still woke at dawn to draw water, still traced equations in frost and shadow. But she knew now her voice could move more than chalk. It could move people. Her mother said one evening, "You chose healing, not revenge. That is harder." Lydia nodded. "The prairie taught me. Fire destroys. But after fire, grass returns. Always." She closed her notebook that night with a new line. Revenge ends stories. Restoration begins them again. And in Kansas, the story was beginning anew. Fields long closed by fear began to breathe. Students once silenced began to dream. And even a broken teacher found himself slowly learning again what it meant to serve truth. All because a farm girl, 12 years old, chose not to strike back, but to plant. By summer, the story of Lydia Carter had drifted far beyond Kansas. What began as whispers in a Topeka classroom had become headlines across the Midwest. Farmgirl cracks. MIT problem. Child genius from Clayton County. Reporters arrived with cameras, but Lydia seldom spoke. She preferred her fields to microphones, her notebook to interviews. Yet stories travel whether you consent or not. Letters arrived in thick envelopes stamped with crests from universities far away. Harvard, Princeton, Stanford. One came with the seal of NASA's Johnson Space Center, the place where Lydia's mother had once walked. Each letter carried an invitation: tours, scholarships, mentorships, opportunities most children only dreamed of. "We would be honored," one began, "to welcome Lydia Carter to our campus." Anne read them aloud at the kitchen table, voice soft with wonder. Lydia listened, hands folded on her lap. When her mother finished, she said only, "That's kind, but I am not ready to leave the prairie." Anne reached across the table, touched her daughter's hand. "You may carry the prairie with you wherever you go." But Lydia shook her head. "I think the prairie still needs me here." That summer, the Carter farm became a schoolhouse. Children from Clayton County, many who had struggled or been overlooked, gathered under the shade of an old oak tree beside the barn. They brought notebooks, pencils, and questions they had never dared to ask in class. Lydia stood before them, chalkboard propped on a pair of hay bales. She wore her patched coat, boots scuffed by soil. Her voice was steady, her explanations simple. She showed them how numbers lived in the turning of wagon wheels, in the angle of barn rafters, in the arc of a stone skipping across a pond. "Math is not a stranger," she told them. "It is your neighbor. You see it every day. In the furrows your father plows, in the quilts your mother sews, in the songs your grandmother hums. All I do is help you notice." The children leaned close, their eyes wide. Some scribbled eagerly. Some just listened, letting the warmth of her words seep into the places where doubt had once sat heavy. And Lydia, though only 12, felt no burden in teaching. She felt joy. For in their faces, she saw herself, the child who had been told she did not belong, the child who almost believed it. News of her small prairie school spread too. A photographer from Kansas City arrived one afternoon, capturing the sight of Lydia writing on the chalkboard beneath the oak, her students cross-legged in the grass. The picture traveled in newspapers nationwide. Beneath it, the caption read, "Genius Farmgirl teaches the forgotten." The image touched something deep in people. Older farmers saw in her their own children. Retired teachers wept, remembering pupils they had lost to silence. Even city dwellers, far from wheat and wind, felt the truth. Brilliance often blooms where no one thinks to look. Meanwhile, Steinberg kept his promise. He wrote apologies until his hand ached. He met with former students, looked them in the eye, admitted his wrongs. Some forgave, some did not. But each apology was a stone lifted from the weight of the past. He also visited Lydia's Oak Tree School. Standing quietly at the edge, he watched her teach. His pride had been broken, but in its place grew something humbler. For the first time in decades, he was learning again. Afterward, he approached her. "You are doing more here," he said softly, "than I ever did in that classroom." Lydia looked at him kindly. "Then help me. Not by teaching, by making sure the gates stay open." He nodded, and he did. One evening, as cicadas hummed and the prairie sky blazed pink, Lydia sat on the fence with her notebook. She wrote, "The prairie holds its own light. It does not need marble halls or golden towers to shine. It shines in children's eyes when they finally believe they can see." She closed the notebook, looked out across the fields. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, lanterns in miniature. She whispered to herself, "That is all the light I need." By autumn, The Prairie Scholars Fund had awarded its first scholarships. 3 children from poor families in western Kansas received money for books, tutors, and supplies. At the ceremony, Marcus Williams spoke with tears in his eyes. "This program," he said, "was born not from punishment, but from forgiveness. And that forgiveness came from a farm girl with cracked boots and an unshakable heart." The audience applauded. But Lydia, standing in the back, simply smiled. She knew applause was like wind. It came, it went. What mattered was the seeds carried with it. Universities continued to call. Harvard offered a place in a summer program. Princeton proposed mentorship with their faculty. NASA invited her to tour the labs where her mother once walked. Lydia accepted visits, curious to see what lay beyond Kansas. She marveled at the telescopes, the laboratories, the vaulted halls of knowledge, but when asked if she would stay, she shook her head. "My home is in Clayton," she said. "There are children here who need me more than I need titles." Her words traveled farther than she imagined. Newspapers wrote, "Farmgirl turns down Harvard to teach at home." Preachers spoke of her in sermons. Old men in diners nodded over their coffee, whispering, "That girl remembers where she came from." And so Lydia's light grew. Not the harsh glare of fame, but the steady glow of a lantern in the dark. She lit not only her own path, but the paths of those around her. In Kansas, people began to believe again that genius was not confined to cities or wealth. It could rise from barns, from kitchens, from fields where wheat bent in the wind. It could wear cracked boots. It could whisper instead of shout. That winter, as snow dusted the prairie, Lydia gathered her students beneath the oak, bundled in coats and scarves. She drew a circle in the snow, wrote equations inside with a stick, and asked them to see not numbers but stories. "Every problem," she told them, "is like a winter. It feels long, it feels cold, but it ends. And when it ends, new life begins." The children nodded, their cheeks red, their eyes bright. And in that moment, beneath the Kansas sky, Lydia Carter's light burned quietly but unmistakably. A farm girl's light, steady enough to awaken an entire state. 6 months had passed since the morning Lydia Carter stood at the blackboard in Roosevelt Middle School. The seasons had turned, wheat had grown and been harvested, snow had dusted the prairies, and the story of the farm girl genius had spread across Kansas like fire through dry grass. But this was no story of fire and ruin. It was a story of light and renewal. In Topeka, Roosevelt Middle had changed. A new mathematics classroom had been built, bright and open, its walls painted in warm colors. On one wall hung a photograph, not of a teacher, but of Lydia. She stood in the image with chalk in hand, hair loose, eyes steady, the blackboard behind her filled with symbols. Beneath the photo, a plaque read, "Math for Everyone." The phrase became more than a motto. It became a program. Across Kansas, schools adopted new practices to seek out talent where once they had dismissed it. Teachers began holding after-school circles, not to sort the gifted from the ordinary, but to invite all children to see math as theirs. Richard Steinberg returned to teaching, but not as before. The school board, after long deliberation, chose not to dismiss him outright. Instead, they gave him a role unlike any he had known, restorative supervisor for overlooked students. It was a title that carried no glory, no power, only service. His task was to find the children he once ignored, the ones with poor grades or patched clothes, and to ensure they were not left behind again. Steinberg accepted with bowed head. He spent his days visiting classrooms, tutoring after hours, and writing letters to colleges for students he had once failed. He was not loved, not yet, but he was useful. And in usefulness, he found the beginnings of redemption. The Prairie Scholars Fund, born from Lydia's request, grew steadily. Donations poured in, from farmers who gave a share of their harvest, from teachers who pledged parts of their salary, from strangers moved by the story. By the following spring, dozens of children had received scholarships for books, tutoring, and opportunities they once believed beyond reach. Every check that left the fund carried Lydia's name on its letterhead, though she never touched the money herself. She insisted, "It belongs to the children, not to me." And Lydia herself? She continued much as before. She woke at dawn, hauled water, fed animals, tended the fields. Under the oak tree beside her family's barn, she gathered children to teach. She wrote in her notebook daily, filling it with sketches of rivers, wheels, shadows, each paired with formulas. Her life remained simple, yet her influence stretched farther than she could imagine. One day, a letter arrived from the capital in Topeka. The governor invited Lydia to speak at a ceremony celebrating education reform. The event would take place in the grand chamber of the Kansas state capitol, beneath the dome where light streamed in through stained glass. Lydia was hesitant. "I'm not a speaker," she told her mother. Anne smiled gently. "You don't need to speak like them. Just speak like you." On the day of the ceremony, dignitaries, teachers, and families filled the hall. Banners hung from the balconies. Reporters set up cameras, their lenses focused on the stage. When Lydia walked forward, wearing her patched coat and cracked boots, a hush fell. She was small against the marble pillars, but her presence was undeniable. She approached the lectern, adjusted the microphone with shy fingers, and looked out at the sea of faces. For a moment, silence held. Then she began. "Math," she said softly, "does not care where you come from. It does not ask if your boots are cracked or your coat is patched. It only asks one question. Can you see the truth?" The room leaned in. "When I stood in that exam hall, they told me I didn't belong. Maybe many of you have been told the same. That you are not gifted. That you should stay in your place. But truth does not live in places. It lives in people, and it waits to be seen." Her voice grew steadier. "A field can be called barren, but if you look closely, seeds are waiting. A river can be called crooked, but if you follow its bend, it leads you home. Children can be called unworthy, but if you give them light, they will grow." She paused, looked down at her hands rough from farm work, dusted faintly with chalk. "I am not here to be celebrated. I am here to remind you, every child deserves a chance. Every field deserves to be planted. Every mind deserves to be trusted, because truth belongs to all of us." Her final words echoed in the high dome. "Math is not a wall. It is a door. Let's keep it open." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then applause thundered, rising like a storm across the hall. Teachers wept openly. Parents clasped hands. Reporters scribbled furiously. And somewhere in the back, Richard Steinberg, head bowed, clapped until his palms stung. That evening, Lydia returned to Clayton. The fields stretched quiet under the twilight sky, the same as they always had. She leaned against the oak tree, opened her notebook, and wrote her last entry for the day. The capital is marble. The prairie is soil. Both can hold truth. But the truth that heals is the truth we share. She closed the notebook, set it on her lap, and watched as fireflies rose from the grass, tiny lanterns glowing in the dark. And so the story of Lydia Carter, the farm girl genius, did not end with equations or applause. It ended with light, steady, humble, enough to guide a generation home. If this story of a farm girl's light touched you, Share it forward. Somewhere, a child has been told they don't belong, and your voice could help open their gate. Let us keep truth, learning, and kindness alive for the next generation. Because fields only grow when their seeds are seen,